Today I'm making dried kale, which I can then use. I can put it in a jar, store it on the shelf, throw it into soups, stews, pasta, anything of that nature. Or I can take it a step further and I can grind this down into a powder that can then be used sort of like a seasoning, can be used on roasted potatoes, vegetables, sprinkled into soups and stews or sauces to kind of boost the nutrition and give all that good stuff that kale has, which is also a nice way to use kale if you have people in your household who don't particularly love it. It's a good way to take advantage of the nutrition and benefits of kale without actually having to eat kale. So kale is really easy to use. I've just dried this in my Excalibur dehydrator. Really simple process. All I did was I washed the kale. I have another tray right here. Washed the kale before it was dried. Obviously pulled it off the stalks. You want to pull it off the stalks because the stalks are too thick. You could dry them, try to powder them down, or use them for something else. I usually just throw them in the freezer, and when I make vegetable stock or broth, I'll throw them in there. But you're just gonna take your pieces, pull them off. This does appear on this video. I just want to mention that these look a little more yellowed than they actually are. I think that's just the color that the camera's picking up. But, you know, you can see where I've pulled it off the stalk. Now, this one I left as a whole leaf. Some of these others I had ripped down into smaller pieces. Nice thing about kale and other leafy greens is that they are easy to just break up. You know, if I decided I didn't want this whole leaf when I go to use it, really easy to make that into little bite-sized portions. That's not so much the case with other types of vegetables, but it's fine for kale and leafy greens. So if you're not sure how you're going to use it or how you want it, go ahead and leave it whole. I usually will have it down into something, if it's being stored as a green that's going to go in a soup or something like that, into about a bite-sized portion. But again, it's easy to break down. And then, you know, some of this I will powder so that I can put it in, you know, I'll put it into roasted potatoes, over roasted meat. It just gives you all those vitamins and minerals that's in the kale. Can impart a savory flavor depending on how much you use, and maybe not if that's not what you're going for. It's also good to mix with other greens, so I'll mix it with like spinach, all sorts of things. Some things when you dehydrate them are a little tricky to tell when they're done. Kale is not one of those things. It literally looks like this when it's finished, even when it's warm. Some things with more sugars in them, like fruit leathers or even sometimes tomatoes or strawberries, things like that, will kind of be a little more leathery and peel up off the things. But your dried greens, your kale, they look like this even when they're warm. So it's a great thing for a beginner to start with. You know, and your process is just taking them off the stems, wash them, get rid of the extra moisture. If there's a little bit of water on them, that's not a big deal. It's going to come off in the dehydrator, but ideally you don't want your trays going in there real wet because it just extends your drying process and your drying time, which means more utility and more electricity use. So you should at least pat them dry with a towel. You can run them through a salad spinner. You could dry them on like a fine mesh screen like this or on a drying rack. And then you're going to lay them out, one single layer. It's okay if they touch a little bit. They, you know, some things you do not want to touch or overlap at all because they just won't dry well. It will kind of trap some moisture in there. But greens, kale, leafy greens, they're so thin that that's not an issue. And they shrink down a lot. So even if they're touching in the beginning, you know, this whole tray, and you can see in the pictures in the article, the whole tray was covered end to end. And then it dries down and there's space and it's all good. So into the dehydrator at between 125 and 145. Sometimes if I want to run the dehydrator and I don't have enough of just greens, but I'm drying something like, say like a pepper or a tomato, I might boost that up, something with more moisture, just to kind of even out. But 125 for about 3 to 5 hours will do your greens well, and you do get a nice green color. Nice color preservative. This is not something that you will maintain if you dry at too high of a heat, over like 140. 125 is really kind of the sweet spot with them. And then you get that nice green color and preservative that also looks nice when it rehydrates. Using it is really easy. If you're cooking a soup or anything with a lot of liquid in it, just throw them in. They're gonna, within minutes, they're gonna look like you threw fresh kale in there. You know, obviously it is not the same as fresh kale, but in a soup, stew, casserole, or sauce, it's going to be very similar to that. You know, otherwise, if you're putting it into something that doesn't have a ton of liquid in it, then you can just soak them for about a half an hour in hot water. Same thing, and then use them in the dish as you would. So, you know, I encourage you to save up your kale. Kale's something that if you're growing it, you're going to have a lot of it, even if you only have a plant or two. It's also something that if you've got bundles from a CSA, a farmer's market, a winter CSA, anything, or you just have a little bit left over from your weekly grocery shopping, dry that little bit, keep it. You know, there's no sense letting good things go to waste. So that's a great way to preserve it. Easy peasy, lots of nutrition. Good luck.